Let's now look at some models of state-society relation. I want to review several kinds of characteristic or stylized relationships between the state and society and see where civil society fits, what its constituent elements are, what its relative size is in different types of political systems. And we'll begin with democracy. In a healthy democratic political system, we have a relatively small state. Now, the state may be larger in some types of democracies, and it may be smaller in others, but the state does not, in a democracy, swallow up a huge amount of organized social life. It's limited. A limited state is an important dimension of having certainly a liberal democracy. Around the state is an arena of organized activity that's called political society. This encompasses political parties, campaign organizations, political support organizations for candidates and individuals. What characterizes different organizations and activities in political society is that they all want to get a place in or control of the state. And that, of course, is a natural, healthy, and necessary phenomenon in a democracy, that different parties and political organizations compete periodically for control of the state. In a kind of outer orbit around the state and political society is civil society. This is the arena of organized, pluralistic life that's seeking to represent the interests of different constituencies, that's seeking to hold the state accountable, that's seeking to come together to perform common activities that might improve the life of the community and perform many other functions that we'll shortly review. Civil society can encompass not only organizations, but the mass media, cultural activities, intellectual life, of course, NGOs, interest groups of various kinds. Then there is, outside of civil society, the wider realm of social life. And this we can call, taking up the term from the civic culture of Amen and Verba, where the parochial dimension or cultural orientation is separate from, withdrawn from politics and political activity. We'll call this parochial society. This is where people come together in family life, in private and interdirected activity, in sports and recreational clubs. And you also have a dimension of economic society outside the state, where people are involved in corporations and trade unions, not as groups trying to improve the society, but just get better wages and working conditions for their different members. Now, here is the most important additional point I would make about these various realms of organized political, social, and economic activity in a democracy or a pluralistic political system. Organizations may be anchored in one realm, but have activities that propel them into a different realm. I would argue that when a trade union is simply acting within the corporation to negotiate for better wages and working conditions for their members, they're acting in economic society in relation to the corporations. But when a trade union is lobbying and protesting for laws that might improve working conditions, that might raise the minimum wage, then they have become an actor in civil society. And when a trade union has endorsed a political party and then may spend some portion of its accumulated resources to mobilize its members and other members of the society to vote for a political party or candidate, then it has propelled itself into the political arena, into political society. By the same token, business enterprises are mainly actors in economic society, but when they start lobbying for legislation or when they become involved in efforts to improve the community and to raise money to make the urban area that they live in safer and more secure, or collaborate with other social groups for some common reform agenda in the political system at any level, then they've crossed over from economic society into civil society. And so you see here corporations acting in different arenas. So we have the ability of different organized actors to act in multiple arenas. They may be anchored in one arena, but are able to act in other arenas as well. Then we have the phenomenon of uncivil groups, terrorist groups, extremist groups, intolerant groups, racist groups that make their presence known and seek to organize, protest, act in the social and political arenas. And they intrude, I'd say, from without the sphere, outside the sphere of a democratic society and political system. And the goal of a democracy is to marginalize them and keep them from exercising undue influence over the society in a way that might polarize the society, violate human rights, and poison the political system and its need for mutual security and for tolerance. Ideally, a democracy would, over time, erode the uncivil groups and change their culture, change their logic, so they become willing and able to accept the norms of a democratic political system. And then they're no longer uncivil, they're civil, and they begin to either melt away or enter into civil society. By the same token, we can have uncivil economic groups that don't accept the norms of an open, transparent economy, that are basically criminal mafia and so on, that are seeking to violate the rule of law and corruptly or violently accumulate wealth in a way that violates the spirit of a liberal democracy. So this is the kind of characteristic structure. The boundaries may move in or out. Organizations may cross from one sphere to another. But this is what a democratic society and political system looks like. Now let's look at the characteristic features of an authoritarian system. First of all, we may have the party and the state fused in an authoritarian regime, and not have, of course, a political society that's competitive. Around the party state, you might have a lot of organizations that are basically controlled by the state. So that's this arena here around the party state, and a relatively thin arena of civil society organizations. It's not that an authoritarian system allows for no civil society at all. It may allow for virtually none if it's very repressive, or it may allow for a substantial one if it's a competitive authoritarian regime that really is a hybrid regime that combines elements of democracy and authoritarianism. Authoritarian regimes vary a great deal in the size of the civil society sector. How wide and substantial is the scope for independent organization, independent media, and so on. You will see in many authoritarian regimes that there's a narrow band outside civil society of more challenging groups that really has to be latent or underground, because if they were surfacing, the state would identify them, repress them, possibly imprison and torture them. So there may be a civil society that is open but modest in its activities and not very threatening to the regime overtly, and a more politically minded and challenging civil society that has to exist underground. And then in many authoritarian regimes, the economy will have a good deal of state ownership and control. Now that's the model, and the different elements and the how large are the arenas around the party state or the authoritarian state may vary from one authoritarian system to another. But this is the kind of structure that we see in the typical non-democracy. There is, however, the model, which is fortunately now dying, of a totalitarian regime, like the Nazi state, classic communist systems, really total systems of political domination and control by a ruling party generally, because to get a truly totalitarian system, one seems to need a mobilizational totalitarian political party to wipe out and level and swallow up all other activity and belief. So in this type of political system, the party state is very large and encompasses a considerable amount of the population in its employment or direct relations of one kind or another, and controls a very substantial share of the total resources of the society. Around the party state is a very substantial arena of organized life that has no independence at all. We have a variety of state-organized groups. Businesses are not really autonomous, but either are owned and controlled by the state or certainly have to answer to and serve the state. Churches are controlled by the state if they're allowed to exist at all, whether it's Christian priests and clergy or Muslim clergy, imams, and so on. They're selected by the state, they're sanctioned by the state, they can be removed by the state. The state cannot allow in a totalitarian system any independent religious life, because that can be the beginning of a challenge to the authority of the state. Obviously, in such a system, all the mass media, television, radio, newspapers are totally controlled and censored by the state, and universities and intellectual life, cultural life, all of this is penetrated by the single party and by the state apparatus and made to serve the aggrandizement and ideological perpetuation of the myth of a ruler and a ruling party that are serving the collective interest. Outside of this massive, almost fused arena of a party state and state-controlled organizational and collective life orbiting around it, is an arena of inward-looking activity, of recreation and family life, of, quote, normal society that lives in the shadow of this massive, fearful party state and must stay out of its way and not question it and not even reveal any true preferences of dissent for fear of exposure and victimization. Now, totalitarian systems have largely disappeared in the world. Obviously, Nazism was defeated and fascism in World War II. The totalitarian communist systems, as in the Soviet Union and China, have disintegrated or have gradually evolved toward a more post-totalitarian, authoritarian direction. Obviously, the Soviet Union doesn't exist anymore. China has evolved toward much more of the authoritarian model we saw here, where there's still a party state, but there's some degree of pluralism emerging now. And so the one country in the world that still, I think, clearly manifests this totalitarian system of really no civil society and a highly mobilized, controlled, ideological, hegemonic sector of organized life around a very big, brutal, and imposing party state is North Korea, the one remaining totalitarian state in the world today. And even there we see the control, the absolute hegemony of the Communist Party state beginning to erode, with people moving across the border between North Korea and China, independent information starting to slip into North Korea, and the various forms and degrees of hegemony beginning to erode. Now I'd like to present finally the model of what's called an authoritarian corporatist system. Authoritarian corporatism does not necessarily seek to eliminate all civil society, though the arena of civil society is usually of truly autonomous activity is usually very small. There's a party state again that's very large. There's a political society around it in what might be a competitive authoritarian regime that is modest and only partially democratic, still heavily living in the shadow of the party state. And then there are a number of different types of not totalitarian but heavily state-influenced and mobilized sectors in what are not a civil society realm, but a realm of a kind of state hegemonic social sector. So a large number of state enterprises, a state-controlled or sanctioned church, state-controlled mass media, and in particular the mobilization of trade unions, interest groups, student organizations, women's groups, even environmental groups that are all directed, managed, suffused with the ideology and mentality and even organizational personnel of the party state. And rather than all of these groups being independent of one another and independent of the party state, you have relations of accountability flowing with control from the party state to these different groups. rather than what would see in a democracy where the groups are autonomously making demands on the party state and seeking to hold it accountable.